Welcome to our deep dive on, well, Steve Jobs. I think it's safe to say most of our listeners are pretty familiar with the Apple Geniuses headlines, but we want to dig a little deeper, right?
Absolutely. And, hopefully uncover some less known facts along the way. We'll be using excerpts from his Wikipedia page, and we'll try to kind of weave all that together to get a better understanding of Jobs, not just as this innovator, but as a person. As I guess, a cultural force too, right?
Yeah, I mean, his early life is pretty fascinating. Like, it almost foreshadows so much of who he became. Okay, so born in San Francisco, given up for adoption, ends up with this working class couple, Paul and Clara Jobs. But here's the thing. His biological parents were college graduates, unmarried, right? And Paul and Clara, they didn't have degrees. But they promised, as part of the adoption, that they'd fund his college education. What do you make of that whole dynamic?
It's a lot to unpack, isn't it? I mean, later in life, Jobs referred to his adoptive parents as his 1,000% parents, which is really interesting. But he also called his biological parents his sperm and egg bank. So you get a sense of this tension, right? This push and pull between these two sets of parents, almost like two different paths his life could have taken.
Yeah, almost like two different worlds colliding. And that kind of continues with his interests, too. Like, here's this kid, fascinated by electronics, tinkering away with his dad in their garage. But he's also drawn to the humanities, inspired by people like, Edwin Land, who invented the Polaroid camera.
Right, exactly. Almost like the technical and the artistic. They were always going to meet up in his later work, which is so interesting to think about. And even back in high school, he was this Silicon Valley kind of archetype, brilliant, rebellious kid looking for his people, skips 5th grade, gives his parents an ultimatum, change schools or else, ends up at Homestead High, smack dab in the middle of this emerging tech scene. And that's where he meets Steve Wozniak, thanks to mutual friend Bill Fernandez.
Homestead High, I mean, that seems like a pivotal moment connecting him with Wozniak, who we all know would become his co-founder at Apple. But it wasn't all serious business, was it? I mean, there's that story about the blue boxes, like these devices they built and sold that let people make free long-distance calls.
Oh, yeah, the blue boxes.
Yeah.
Totally illegal, but pretty clever, you have to admit. So Wozniak, he was the tech whiz, right? And Jobs, he's the one who sees the market, the opportunity. It's like a glimpse of, well, I guess their entrepreneurial spirit. Like they find a need and they fill it, even if it means, well, bending the rules a little bit.
Right. It's like this theme with Jobs challenging the status quo, almost like he's not afraid to kind of push the boundaries. It makes you think about, his fascination with the counterculture, the whole LSD thing, that crazy spiritual trip he took to India looking for enlightenment.
Oh, yeah, for sure. All those experiences, and especially his later exploration of Zen Buddhism, it had a huge influence on his design aesthetic. Like the whole Zen thing, right? Simplicity, elegance, focus on what's essential. Those became like hallmarks of Apple products later on.
So we've got this complex young man, driven, rebellious, fascinated by tech, but also really interested in the whole human experience. So how does this all lead to, the birth of Apple? Was it a sudden aha moment or more like a slow burn?
Well, it's that classic story, right? Brilliant idea taking root in, of all places, a garage. Jobs and Wozniak, they start Apple in Jobs' family garage, selling their stuff to fund their dream. It's pretty scrappy,
Yeah.
really resourceful. And their first creation, the Apple I computer, I mean, compared to what we have now, it looks, I don't know, primitive.
Yeah.
But for its time, it was revolutionary.
Oh, I bet. And I imagine those early days at Apple, it must have been, I don't know, chaotic. You've got Jobs, this eccentric personality, but he's got this undeniable business sense.
Totally. It was. He was relentless about getting investors, about making people believe in their vision,
Yes.
And it's interesting, he wasn't actually that keen on bringing in Mike Scott as Apple's CEO at first. I think it shows you how much he wanted to be in control even back then.
Yeah, that desire for control definitely seems to be a recurring theme. Speaking of which, what about his relationship with Chrisanne Brennan? Because it seems like, as Apple takes off, things get more strained between them. And then there's the whole thing with Lisa's birth, right in the middle of all this.
Yeah, the timing is, well, it's striking. Brennan gets pregnant with Lisa. Jobs, at first, he denies being the father. Then the DNA test confirms it. And all this is happening while he's pouring everything he has into building Apple. And of course, you can't ignore the fact that he's developing the Apple Lisa computer around the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, he initially said that Lisa stood for Local Integrated Software Architecture, but later he admitted it was named after his daughter.
Whoa, that's a lot. I mean, it's hard to even imagine, right? You're leading this company that's exploding, you're dealing with fatherhood, and you're not even publicly acknowledging it at this point. It's like this whole other layer of pressure, you know?
It's a glimpse into a side of Jobs that I think a lot of people didn't see at the time. It's a pretty compelling story, for sure.
It really is amazing how even with all this stuff going on in his personal life, Jobs just kept pushing his vision for Apple forward. And, the development of the Macintosh, it was a big deal, not just for Apple, but for like the whole personal computing world.
Yeah, the Macintosh was clearly like his baby.
Yeah.
What was it about that specific computer that he was so, I don't know, fixated on?
Well, Jobs, he always had this idea of making computers that anyone could use, not just engineers or tech people. And he'd seen the Xerox Alto with its graphical user interface, and he just knew that was the future, It was going to change how people interacted with computers completely. And then, of course, there's that 1984 Super Bowl ad, directed by Ridley Scott, no less. It captured that whole vision of Apple as this like rebellious force taking on the big guys. Oh man, that commercial, I still get chills when I see it. It was more than just an ad, right? It was a statement like Apple was on a mission to give power to individuals through tech.
Exactly. But, like a lot of things with Jobs, this whole period, it was also full of conflict. His vision for the Mac, it clashed with John Scully, the CEO at the time. Scully was more, I guess, practical. And Jobs was Jobs. He wanted to change the world, And that clash, it would lead to Jobs leaving Apple, the company he started.
It's almost, I don't know, Shakespearean, this visionary kicked out of his own kingdom. What was at the heart of it, do you think? Was it personality, or was it more like fundamental differences in how they saw Apple's future?
It's probably a bit of both, to be honest. Scully, he was all about market share, making money. And Jobs, he was an idealist. He wanted to revolutionize things. And, his style, it didn't help. He was demanding, could be abrasive. So, yeah, it created some friction.
Okay, so 1985, Steve Jobs gets, well, I guess exiled is the right word, from Apple. But as we know, that's not the end of the story. He starts NextT, this computer company that focused on high-end workstations. Even got an investment from Ross Perot. You remember him, the
Right.
billionaire who ran for president?
I remember Ross Perot. So NextT, I think it shows you how much Jobs just needed to be pushing boundaries.
Yeah.
Technologically. I mean, the NextT computer, man, it was way ahead of its time. Like that magnesium casing, the object-oriented software system, and the multimedia email. You could send voice, images, video back when that was unheard of.
That's wild. It's so funny how things that seem like mind-blowing back then are totally normal now.
I know, right? But even though it was super advanced, the NextT computer, it was expensive, like almost 10 grand in 1990. So it was mostly for universities, businesses, that kind of thing.
Okay, so not a huge commercial success then. But there's a twist, right? Something pretty major happened on a NextT computer that, well, that changed everything.
Oh, you're talking about Tim Berners-Lee. He invented the World Wide Web on a NextT computer. Think about that. The whole foundation of the internet, built on a machine created by the guy who just got kicked out of Apple. It's kind of poetic. In a way, isn't it?
Totally. Talk about an unexpected legacy. But NextT wasn't the only thing Jobs was up to. He also bought this, well, kind of small computer graphics company from George Lucas called the Graphics Group.
Which became Pixar, of course. Jobs, he just had this knack for seeing the potential in things, He knew computer animation was going to be huge, even when I think a lot of people were still skeptical.
And then, boom, Toy Story comes out in 1995. And it wasn't just a tech demo. It was a great story, something that everyone could connect with.
Totally. Pixar, with Jobs in charge, they just, redefined what animation could be. Toy Story and all the movies that came after it was a revolution in storytelling.
But it seems like even with all the success, Jobs, his personality, let's say, hadn't changed that much. His battles with Michael Eisner, Disney CEO, they were pretty legendary.
Oh, man, those two. So much clashing. They were both strong personalities, and they couldn't agree on what Pixar should be. And Jobs, he actually said he'd never work with Disney again after one deal fell apart.
Wow, talk about holding a grudge. It seems like if you got on Jobs' bad side, you were there for good. But then things change at Disney, right?
Yeah.
New leadership.
Right. Bob Iger takes over, and he's a different kind of leader. He sees Pixar's value, and he's also, I think, more diplomatic than Eisner. So he manages to, patch things up with Jobs.
And that leads to Disney buying Pixar in 2006 for, $7.4 billion.
Crazy.
From sworn enemies to, partners in a mega deal.
Yeah, pretty wild. It was a
Yeah.
win-win, really. Disney gets the best animation studio in the world, and Jobs, he becomes Disney's biggest shareholder and gets a seat on the board. So he's got this platform to, like, reach even more people.
It's funny how life can, like, circle back around, you know?
Ugh.
But while all this is going on with Pixar, something else is happening. Apple, the company Jobs built, the company he had to leave, it's on the verge of going under.
I know, it's hard to imagine now, right? Apple, this tech giant, almost bankrupt. What happened? Did they just, like, lose their edge?
It was a lot of things, I think. They weren't innovating as much. Their products got kind of confusing. And Microsoft Windows, it was just like taking over.
Yeah, classic case of a company losing its way after the founder leaves, you know? But what we know, Jobs was going to make a comeback.
And he does. In 1997, Apple buys NXT, and Jobs is back at Apple. Was it like a last-ditch effort by a dying company, or was it a calculated risk to bring Apple back to life?
I think it was a bold move, for sure. A lot of people thought it was crazy. But looking back, it was the right move. It was the start of Apple becoming, well, Apple.
Jobs' return, it was like watching a company get resurrected. He went in and cut projects, streamlined things, and brought back that focus on design, on the user experience, the things that had made Apple special in the beginning.
And it worked fast. The iMac, when it came out in 1998, it was a game changer. That colorful, all-in-one design, it was so different from everything else. You know, it was like Apple was back and they were being playful again.
Right, the iMac, it was more than a computer, it was a statement. Like, this is what Apple is about. Simple, elegant, easy to use, and fun. People wanted it not just because it worked well, but because it looked good. It made you feel something.
Exactly. Jobs understood that. He knew design mattered. He wanted to make products that people connected with emotionally. And he didn't stop with the iMac.
Yeah.
Then you get the iPod, iTunes, the iTunes Store. Apple wasn't just about computers anymore. It was a lifestyle.
Genius, right. They built this whole ecosystem where the hardware, the software, the content, it all worked together. But Jobs was more than just a product guy. He was a showman, you know? Those keynotes, the Steve Notes, they were events. Everyone waited for them.
They were like rock concerts. And Jobs, up there in his black turtleneck and jeans, he just owned the stage. He made you believe in Apple, you know? It was about technology, design, but it was also about emotion. He was a master storyteller.
He had this aura, you know, like a mix of brilliance and something else, something maybe a little darker, maybe like that whole fight he had with Michael Dell, the CEO of Dell. It was brutal.
Oh, yeah. The Dell-Jobs rivalry, it was epic. Jobs loved competition, loved proving people wrong. And he wasn't afraid to get nasty, like that email he sent to Apple employees when Apple's market cap passed Dell's. Classic Jobs. Savage, but funny.
He was a fighter, that's for sure. But then, you know, while his career's going through the roof, he gets hit with this personal battle. 2003, he's diagnosed with pancreatic cancer.
Yeah. And at the time, he kept it pretty quiet. His decision to try alternative medicine instead of, regular treatment, that's been talked about a lot. We'll never know if doing things differently would have changed things, but it makes you think about about those big choices people face when it comes to their health.
It's such a personal thing, you know. But Jobs, he was determined. He had the Whipple procedure in 2004 and then a liver transplant in 2009. Tim Cook, the guy who would take over for him at Apple, he even offered to donate part of his own liver.
Wow, that's intense. It shows you the kind of bond they had, right? In the middle of all that Silicon Valley craziness.
Yeah.
But even with all that, Jobs' health kept getting worse. He had to take time off from Apple, and then, in 2011, he resigned as CEO.
At the end of an era, it really makes you think about how fragile life is, you know, even for someone like Jobs who seemed, I don't know, invincible. And then 6 weeks after stepping down, he died. He was only 56. And his last words, they were, "Oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow." I mean, what do you even say to that?
I know. It's hard to wrap your head around it. When he died, it wasn't just the tech world that felt it. It was like the whole world was in shock. He wasn't just a tech guy. He was an icon,
Yeah.
He changed how we live, how we work, how we do everything.
Yeah, he did. And his legacy, I mean, it's everywhere. It still shapes the tech world and beyond. He inspired so many people to think differently, to push boundaries. But, it's not all like sunshine and roses. He had his dark side. He could be really tough to work for. He played hardball in business. And his personal life, well, it was complicated.
Right. You have to look at the whole picture, the good and the bad. Jobs, he reminds us that even the most brilliant people, they're still human. They have flaws. They make mistakes. It's part of what makes them interesting, I guess.
It's funny. We tend to think about these huge figures, and we forget that they have, normal lives too. But when you look at their personal relationships, it tells you so much about who they really are.
Totally. And Jobs' personal life, man, it was a whole other saga. His marriage to Laureen Powell in '91, that's pretty interesting. They had a Buddhist ceremony at the On Mead Hotel in Yosemite, which, I don't know, it just seems so not Silicon Valley, you know?
Yeah, it's like a whole different side of him, right? Like this yearning for peace, for something deeper, especially with how crazy his work life was.
Exactly. Even someone like Jobs, someone who was so driven, so ambitious, he still needed that connection, you know? And they had 3 kids together, Reed, Aaron, and Eve. So, yeah, his family is a big part of his life.
But before Laureen and their kids, there was Chris and Brennan and their daughter, Lisa. We talked about it a little earlier, but it's a tough story. Denying paternity, the DNA test, then eventually they kind of reconnect.
Yeah, it's messy. It shows you how complicated relationships can be, especially when you throw in Jobs' personality and all the pressure he was under at the time. You know, Brendan actually said that Jobs' sister, Mona Simpson, she was a big part of, like, healing things between them.
Wait, sister? He had a sister.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that part.
Mm-hmm.
So Jobs, he was adopted, right? And in the late 80s, he decided to find his biological family. He finds his birth mother, Joanne, and it turns out he has a younger sister.
Wow, that must have been intense, finding this whole other family, this part of yourself that you never knew about.
I know, right? And Jobs and Mona, they got really close. She became like someone he could really talk to, someone who got him, someone who could, I guess, give him some perspective, you know?
Yeah.
Especially during the tough times.
Makes you wonder how all that affected him, you know? Being adopted, then finding his biological family. Did it fuel his ambition, his need to be in control? I don't know. It's all kind of connected, right?
Oh, for sure. It's all part of who he became.
Mm.
But one thing that people always debated about Jobs was, well, his philanthropy,
Mm-hmm.
or I guess lack of it. He was really private about his donations, so some people criticized him, said he wasn't giving enough, especially with how much money he had.
That's a good point. You do kind of have a responsibility when you have that much wealth, right?
Yeah,
'Cause
there's-
But then some people said, no, Jobs' biggest contribution was like his products, that Apple's technology, that was his way of making the world a better place.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Some people think giving money directly is the only way, that it's the best way to help. But others, like Jobs, they think their work, their innovations, that's their contribution.
Jobs really believed that tech could change things for the better, that it could empower people. And even though he didn't talk about it a lot, he did support some causes. AIDS research, Stanford Hospital.
It's all about how you see it, right? There's no one right way to make a difference. Jobs, he put his energy into Apple, into making products that, to him, were changing the world.
So where does this leave us? Steve Jobs, visionary, innovator, master marketer, but also a flawed person, capable of incredible kindness and, well, incredible cruelty. His story it's complicated, full of brilliance, but also controversy, triumphs and failures, connection and loneliness.
That's it, right? He was driven, demanding, even ruthless sometimes. But he was also charismatic, and he really believed in the power of, I guess, human creativity to make a difference. And his legacy, it's still with us, still inspiring people, still making people argue.
It reminds us that these huge figures we see in the headlines, they're not just like cardboard cutouts, you know? They're complicated. They have strengths and weaknesses, good times and bad times. They're human, and that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting. We went past the headlines, past the myth of Steve Jobs, and we saw the man behind it all.
Totally. Hopefully this deep dive give you some things to think about. How do we look at the good and the bad together? Was Jobs more about tech or about humanity? It's not easy to answer, but that's kind of the point, isn't it?
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the life of Steve Jobs. We hope you learned something, and maybe it got you thinking.